Dum dum da dum dum da da dum dum da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da dum dum da dum dum da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da 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 dum 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 dum. Hello, folks. Dave Lentz here. Today we're going to talk about the important topic. It's very relevant today. This is March the 5th, 2021. And we're going to talk about socialism and communism. We're going to talk about what the basic characteristics of those systems are, what folks who espouse those philosophies, what they believe in. We're going to try to clear up some fallacies. Talk a little bit about economic performance of countries that have utilized that philosophy or those philosophies, and try to make this as no-nonsense, fair, balanced, and even and factual as it possibly can be. Because of time limitations, we can't really get into any great depth or detail about the important subjects of the Russian Revolution and the Communist Chinese takeover of mainland China right after World War II. Okay, and I probably should mention here that I do have a degree in political science. It was gotten many years ago, more than I'd like to admit. And I've worked on several political campaigns, and so I have a little bit of a background in all this kind of stuff, and certainly have been tested on it at one time or another. But in any event, I appreciate you tuning in, and so let's get started. Thanks. Okay, socialism, society's savior or boogeyman. We're going to give you our thoughts on this. We're also going to have a discussion here of communism, at least according to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. We'll talk about some of the characteristics of those systems of government and a little bit of information about their performance economically in the past and how they impinge on individual rights, etc. We're going to briefly mention, but not really explore, the communist revolution in Russia and the communist takeover of mainland China right after World War II. So let's get started. Okay, this is a very broad topic. And this preliminary stuff is, if you want to research it further, go ahead. But basically, that first slide is pretty much self-explanatory. I'm just going to move along just to keep the conversation here in this video as short as possible. Anyway, I guess what I'm getting at here is that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels did not invent socialism, okay? That was an idea that preceded their time, and that's pretty much what you should get from this first slide. Now, as we will see in a few minutes, actually, in terms of socialism, what we're going to talk about mostly here is when we discuss socialism, we will discuss it mostly in the way that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and if I say Marx, I mean most of the time I mean both Marx and Engels. We're going to use the term socialism pretty much the way Marx used it. So this is a very sort of traditional definition that we're using here, but we're also going to talk about how other people use that term. But when we say socialism here, that's pretty much what we mean, unless the context clearly requires otherwise. Well, obviously, the term socialism means different things to different people, and that's really the basic reason we're doing this video. There's a lot of people that attach different meanings to the word socialism, and that's true for communism as well. means different things to different people. And so hopefully we'll be able to narrow that focus a little bit. Basically, some folks believe that anytime the government pays any of its citizens any benefits under any kind of social program, that it's socialism. Some folks that think that progressive tax systems are socialistic. Other folks think that any attempts by government to reallocate wealth or income and or to remove any disparities in them is socialism. So it can mean, that's what I mean by it means different things to different people. Okay, so we're going to basically talk here about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' definition of socialism, and then communism. And there's even different forms of communism other than what Marx talked about. As a matter of fact, a lot of the communist countries, either present or past, really did not have a truly Marxist system in place. And that's one of the points that we want to make here. But of course, Karl Marx's famous document is the Communist Manifesto. And he was writing basically about the middle of the 1800s. And these were very tumultuous times because the world was going through the Industrial Revolution. There was a lot of complaining going on about working conditions in factories, and gave rise to a lot of worker discontent. But there were other reasons why there was a lot of turmoil during the 1800s. Europe was just coming out of the Napoleonic Wars. Germany, and I believe even Italy were not unified at this time, and were really a bunch of separate little fiefdoms, dukedoms or something, but they were not nation states in the sense that we think of them today. So there was a lot of maneuvering going on between countries for power, trying to bring together nation states. In the case of Germany, and there were German revolts in 1848 regarding, and like I said, German unification. France and Prussia had at least one war. This was the latter part of that century. The 1800s was the age of Bismarck, and like I said, there was a lot of societal discontent and about worker conditions. Now, Marx and Engels and their political and economic theory, simply put, was that had to do with how political and economic systems would change over time. They thought, let me just say this, England at this time had what was, even though they had a monarchy, it was a constitutional monarchy. And France was oscillating back and forth between monarchy and republic, and sort of in a sense, even in this, like in England's case, they had a constitutional monarchy. So even though it was a monarchy, it was an economy based pretty much on a capitalistic system. And a lot of Marx theory deals with the assumption that what you're talking about, capitalism, free markets under like Adam Smith, free trade. And Marx thought that capitalism created these terrible working conditions, and that capitalism had its own seeds of destruction because it alienated workers. The work was boring, it was dangerous, it was dehumanizing. And the lurch towards specialization made everything else even worse. He said that what modern work was insecure. You could be laid off at any time. Doesn't that ring a bell? In the age of changing technology, even today. He said the workers are exploited and paid too little because all the big money goes to the capitalists. He said the capitalism is unstable because, in essence, it became so efficient that you could produce more than the population could consume, and that this eventually led to unemployment. He said the capitalism had a bad psychological effect on people. He said it causes people to stay in unloving marriages. He said there were financial reasons that people stayed in marriage as opposed to love. He said it makes people insecure and very competitive, cutthroat. He said it makes people conformist. And he thought these were all bad happenings, and that they made people unhappy. And he said that the rich get richer under capitalism. He said he thought this because he said the capitalists have to make more and more money because the only way they can get rich is to pay the workers less and less. Marx and later Marxist writers noted and believed that there's a tendency in capitalism towards centralization and concentration of wealth. I'm talking here about a tendency in capitalism towards monopolies. Thus, Marx believed that we should redistribute the wealth created by the wealth excesses that capitalism created. Okay, so Marx looked at the world and the root causes of all the changes that he thought were going to occur was this notion of class struggle between the bourgeois and the working class. Now, the bourgeois was the ruling class, and the working class, of course, are the workers. They're called the proletariat. MT is Marx's theory. Marx states that capitalism will self-destruct because of this inevitable conflict between the bourgeois and the proletariat. And he said that societies will eventually change to a socialist mode of production, and that it will ultimately lead to a classless society. Very simply put, Marx thought that societal struggle will cause political and economic systems to change as follows. And this is the very important progression that Marx thought would occur, that societies would start in capitalism, then they would move and evolve, or through revolution, go into a state of socialism, and then eventually, over time, they would end up communist. So that's the stage: capitalism, socialism, communism, in that order. You sort of move through that chain of events. Now, Marx opposed things like slavery because, well, as you'll see in a minute, he believed that everything would eventually end up, and it would be wise to do so, to have a classless society. Marx did support from time to time various attempts to overthrow various governments. And he thought that religion was the opiate of the masses, and that the function of religion was only to help the bourgeois suppress the working class. He said that what religion often acted at was what it often acted as was a support mechanism for oppressive regimes. Marx apparently believed that socialism could come about via the ballot box in some countries, such as the United States. So, although he talked about struggle, and sometimes the implication, if not expressly, at least impliedly, was that this struggle would be violent, he did apparently believe that in some countries, this progression from capitalism to socialism to communism could take place at the ballot box. Let me just say this: a lot of this Marxist communist theory stuff, I mean, ever since the time of Marx, various disciples of communism and Marxism have given a lot of this stuff different interpretations. So I'm trying to generalize and sort of get to the center of gravity of what most people think about these philosophies. And we're going to leave to you to study why Marx said the class struggle occurs and whether Marx's explanation makes sense. But within the followers of Marx, there have been big disagreements during the course of history. There have been genuine differences of interpretation of Marx by various communist parties in different countries and political leaders, and outright deviations from what Marx said. For example, does Marx's theory apply to agrarian societies or just industrial societies? This next one points a really, really big point. Are dictatorships a part of a genuine communist system under true Marxist theory? Obviously, Stalin and Mao Zedong believed so, but is that what Marx believed when he wrote all this stuff? And here we go again. I ask the question again. Are dictatorships necessarily a part of a genuine communist system under Marx? And I point out that an argument can be made that he doesn't believe that it's supposed to be dictatorships because, as we will see, one of the elements of a true Marxist system is that it's stateless. So how can you have dictators in a stateless system? When we talk about dictatorships, and of course, especially Stalin and Mao, but other communist leaders as well, took their countries, even though they were on their face communist. That's what, even though those countries were on their face communist, both Stalin and Mao were essentially dictators. Is that something that Marx had in mind? Like I said, Marx said communism would be stateless. So, but when we say dictatorship, we're basically talking about one person in control. There are no civil rights, no freedom of speech, no due process of law, a small group of people, unrepresentative of the country at large, basically has total control and they're answerable to no one. That's what we mean by dictatorship. Okay, but it should be pointed out right here that it's not just communist countries that can become dictatorships. Now, there's no holier than thou in all this. Democracies as well can degenerate into dictatorships. Just consider Germany in the 30s when Hitler rose to power originally largely through democratic means. And also communist countries like today's communist China have an economic system that has been moving in the direction of capitalism. So you see communism, one-party rule in an economic system that is largely capitalistic. So things get very confused. And so when we say that one of the worst things about communism is its tendency towards dictatorship, that does not necessarily make a capitalistic system or a democracy immune to that danger. Okay, what is socialism? Well, according to Marx's theory, it's the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's a very interesting choice of words. I don't think he necessarily meant that exactly like we might take that, but I'll leave it to you to try to figure that out. Anyway, in a socialist system, he said that the following are the characteristics of a socialist system. In a socialist system, the following are owned by the community. Interesting choice of words. Now, we just naturally think of the word community as being the government. But I think that he was talking there in terms of communism communism, when that stage is reached, government is done away with and everything is sort of operated by the community. But before you get there, the word, and you're still in a socialist system, most people think of the word community as being the government. But anyway, the government in a socialist system owns the means of production, the means of distribution, and the means of exchange. Okay. Now, the means of production, basically, that's where, like, if all of a sudden the government owns the banks, the government owns the trains, the government owns the buses, the government owns the phone companies, the government owns factories, the government owns on and on and on. That is a true socialist system. And Marx generally believed that when I say owns that stuff, he means all of it eventually to be a true socialist system. The means of production, the means of distribution, and the means of exchange. To the extent, the higher percentage of all of these things that are owned by the government, the more of a socialist system you have. Now, even though those three items don't appear to mention social safety net programs expressly, my guess is that implicit within the means of distribution, you are talking about those types of safety net programs. But clearly, people today view any kind of social safety net program that the government implements, like food stamps or unemployment insurance. A lot of folks associate that with socialism. Now, one step above socialism, remember, it goes from capitalism to socialism to communism, which is stage 3, according to Marx. Communism is the reformation of socialism into a system with the following characteristics. It has all of the socialism characteristics, all of this stuff down here, plus it has these things. Okay, and this is where things can get a little bit squirrely, because it's really unclear to me, at least, whether Marx was actually trying to specifically delineate in detail what exactly happens in an upper stage communist system. My readings are he's ambiguous, and so I've got to basically work with that ambiguity. And also it gets more complicated because there are various revisionist types of Marxist theories and revisionist types of communist theories. So anyway, with that in mind, that's the last slide. All right, so Marx believed that a upper stage it goes from capitalism to socialism to communism, that when you got to communism, it had all of the characteristics of a true socialist system, all these characteristics that we just discussed, plus these down here. Now, this is where it gets really squirrely, because a lot of people are going to just say that it's a totally classless society and totally wealth and income equality existed. Yes, I think he probably clearly did feel that there would be no rich or no poor. I think that that's probably a correct generalization. And certainly, I think he was pretty much here, but his position is nuanced. But he also believed it was stateless, so that basically there's no real need for government, and it's moneyless. And let's sort of try to elaborate on these points, and we'll do that by looking at the next slide here. And so this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy, but I'm going to try to hit on these main points about no private property and equality of income and wealth. Okay, I need to emphasize again, if I haven't already done so, in putting together this video, every time I would go back to double check myself on making certain points, I would find a lot of different variations and explanations. And indeed, there are many types of Marxists and many types of communists. In other words, usually you have sort of an orthodox type of fashion or an orthodox type of faction, and then some splinter revisionist group. And going back to, and it goes back to something that's actually on the last video here that I will show you when I get to the end that for your further considerations. You may want to look up dialectic materialism. But of course, Vladimir Lenin had his own slight variations on Marx. You had the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks. Leon Trotsky, how his thoughts were different than Stalin's, and Mao Zedong, of course. And all this got down to whether or not communism was appropriate in a primarily agrarian society. What I'm basically saying here is that this is actually a broad field of study on its own, and there are many types of Marxist thoughts and communist thoughts. And so the points that are being made in this video are very much generalizations. Indeed, I found on many occasions on several points that there are conflicts between what some sources and authorities say versus what other sources and authorities say. But for our purposes here, we're not going to split hairs on some very fine but important points. Just trying to give a basic understanding. So with that clearly stated yet again, I wanted to say, of course, we were talking about, under Marx, basically, generally speaking, under Marxist theory, you have socialism, where basically the community, or I guess the government, owns the means of production. But of course, in a true communist state, according to Marx, at least according to our discussion here, it's stateless. So really, it's basically, a group of people running the society. How that is worked out, whether it comes down to communes and what exactly runs the show. Marx isn't always very specific on a lot of these very important points, and he says it's not his duty to do so, because I think in a lot of respects, he had a lot of faith that things would just evolve evolve a certain way after class struggle ran its course. But in any event, it was we would call it classless, Marx sort of believed that upper stage communism was would be a super productive society, and that would produce a lot of abundance, and that there would be no need for private property, so that this idea of communal property or no private property would sort of naturally evolve because of all the advantages of reaching a state of communism. That's sort of my understanding, but most people will just come out and say that there's no private property in communism. I don't think that even totally in any state that's ever existed under what is stated to be a communist regime, where there's been absolutely no private property. I think that may be important. There may have been no private property with respect to important assets, but you will hear in this concept that there's no private property. Yeah, when I say no private property, I basically, very simply put, mean that
all property is jointly owned by everybody. The property is owned by the community, which in a sense is sort of the government, because the people are the government, whether it's by the commune, the cooperative, or whatever the ultimate state of communism is. And in terms of strict wealth and income equality, you'll hear that a lot, that the communist systems believe in strict wealth and income equality. Oddly enough, from what I've read, Marx himself did not necessarily believe that or profess or support that point. I think that he basically thought that there would be so much abundance that everybody got what they needed. And, and in a sense, because there's so much abundance, that you really wouldn't need money, that you just contributed what you were able to contribute. You got what you needed, and everybody was sort of, fat and happy. There's been a lot of argument amongst the Marxists themselves and scholars over the extent to which Marx tried to totally delineate what the ultimate state of Marxism was in specific detail. And he felt that once there were no classes, there would be no need for government itself. And that really gets you to this classless society. But anyway, so you have government owning all the means of production, and then you have a classless society. There's no money, and there's really no government. I mean, you're talking about like the communes, and there's really no private property. Propertyless, I guess you could put in here. Okay, let's see. But I want to point out that if you look at how difficult this state is to achieve, well, there's never been a country that I know of, unless, and not in this day and age, that's totally stateless. Yeah, no country's ever truly achieved a communist state in the sense that Marx thought of a communist state. At most, what you've had in the history of the world is a very socialistic state that has been ruled by one communist party that has been more or less pretty darn totalitarian. See, he says the whole purpose of government was to help the bourgeois suppress the working class. And so when he says dictatorship of the proletariat, I think that's why I use that term, is to basically to indicate that the workers had eventually struggled and had eventually prevailed in their struggle against the bourgeois, and sort of, whereas before it was the dictatorship of the bourgeois, now it's the dictatorship of the working class, whereas he means dictatorship in the sense of who has control. One of the hallmarks of communist governments have been these things, these centrally planned economies. They usually, you have these things called 5-year plans. When you had those, the government would try to figure out what would be needed over the next 5 years by the people of the country, which is just the opposite of having free markets. People determine what they want in the future, how many, how much bread has to be made, how much steel has to be made, how many computers have to be made. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't explain that very well. The difference between the 5-year plan that communist systems use, basically the central government, in our case, would be like in Washington, D.C., if we were communist. Washington, D.C., the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., I should say the civil servants in Washington, D.C., would try to figure out in Washington what the folks in Alaska and in Hawaii and Maine and Florida, how many cars they're going to want, how many computers they're going to want. And so they're going to turn around and tell the state-owned system how many cars and computers and widgets and you name the product to produce, and that's going to be sold to the people in Maine, Florida, Maryland, and you name it. And so they don't have really the feedback, like, for example, in a capitalist system like we have. If General Motors or Tesla or Apple, when they try to figure out how many cars they're going to produce or how many computers they're going to produce, they've got a lot of feedback. They're right there on ground level with the customers. They've done a lot of market research. And probably the most important aspect of it, not only are they closer to the customer, as opposed to being far away like somebody in Washington trying to figure out what they want in California, but also in the private system like we have, the employees, the engineers, the accountants, and the salespeople, they all get together and they make these plans. But if they guess wrong and they produce too much of one thing, well, guess what? Those companies are going to lose lots of money and they may lose their job. That's less likely to occur in a communist system where you have bureaucrats. And the other element of that is that economies change and circumstances change quickly. And if you've got a 5-year plan and your government has told your factories to produce so many cars or widgets or computers, and all of a sudden something in the world economy, or even there's a famine or whatever, private enterprise is much better able because they're closer to the customer and they plan every year. They don't have this 5-year projection. They can adjust much more quickly than a 5-year communist system. It's hard to generalize, of course, but history has shown that the 5-year planning system that communist countries have employed, where the government tries to make these predictions and then they order their manufacturers to produce so many of whatever, at GM or at Tesla or at Apple, I mean, if they see sales are going to go slow, they know faster and they will slow production down, and there's less mismatching of supply and demand. So the capitalistic system has proven better than the 5-year planning system of communist countries. Okay, and we say the communist countries have shown a tendency towards dictatorship, which of course inhibits freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and it's repressive against dissent. And there's no free flow of ideas, which of course inhibits to a large extent innovation. Okay, there's international aspects to Marx's theory. Marx believed that all workers, regardless of their country, should unite around the world and revolt against capitalists and the bourgeois who control the economies of the world. So it's supposed to be an international movement. And he really thought that if this happened, that workers would be more loyal to each other, their fellow workers in other countries, than they would be to their own countries. And that has not shown to be the case. I mean, we've seen communist countries fighting each other. For example, Red China had a little war there with Vietnam, even right after we left Vietnam. In fact, I think they actually did some fighting while we were there. And I know that the Soviets and the Red Chinese had sort of some border skirmishing going on. And so communist countries have shown a willingness to even fight each other. And there certainly have been times during the course of history where China and the Soviet Union, present day Russia, have not gotten along at all. All right, socialism today, and this is where the confusion comes in. Today, right or wrong, many, if not most folks refer to socialism as having something to do with government ownership or control of some or all business assets, plant and equipment. Now that generally is in fact a consistent notion with what Marx said, the means of production. So that really is sort of true Marxism right there, that first bullet. Now the second one is more it's not really what Marx talked about, but when you got to a classless state under communism, not socialism, the idea of having a classless society is sort of consistent with this, but a lot of people talk about this today as being socialism. Not to argue whether it's right or wrong. It gets down to what were the inferences of what Marx was talking about when he said socialism. But I told you what the three characteristics of socialism were. I think it's back here. No, that's communism. Yeah. This is what the government does. They own the means of production, the means of distribution, the means of exchange. So in any event, okay, here we are. Let's go. What is Marxism? There are many variants of communist thought that differ over the need for revolution, participation in voting in capitalist systems, whether to go straight to communism from capitalism, whether communism is right, or the steps of the evolution of societies when you're talking about an agricultural type country instead of an industrial one. There are many variations of communism. But basically, well, I've already covered that. All right. Okay, now here's a point of great confusion as well. And I hesitate to even draw these distinctions. But the most important lesson you can learn from what I'm about to say is that you actually have to look at what the individual part, regardless of what they call themselves and how they label themselves, you have to look at what they actually believe in. What they actually do is even better instead of what they say to determine what they are. The key word here is the second word in their names. Social Democrats, that's the key word. By and large, they believe in, I'm going to generalize a whole lot here, but so you have to really look at each individual case. But for our purposes, when we say a social democrat, these guys believe in basically Western style government, free elections, but they're social in the sense that they do believe in providing their populations with a government safety net. Government benefits, unemployment benefits, Social Security, Medicare, all that kind of stuff. That's what a typical social democrat is. And these labels are typically applied in Europe or elsewhere. But when we say social democrat, we're basically talking about something like you would get in a lot of the parties in Western Europe who basically get a lot of support from labor unions, and they believe in a lot of social programs, a lot of safety net programs to help people that are less able to help themselves, the poor, in other words, or the sick. Now, democratic socialists, if you look at the second word, it's socialist. And these folks have a tendency, and I'm generalizing, like I said, you've got to look at specific countries, specific circumstances, regardless of what they really call themselves. But democratic socialists have a tendency to be leaning more towards the communist side. I mean, they are in fact socialists. They want the government to own the means of production. A lot of times they have a tendency to believe in like a one-party system. They're less inclined to believe in Western-style democracy. So these are really two different groups, very different, similar names, but really potentially very different. And like I said, for example, democratic socialists, the key word is socialists, they have a tendency, they don't believe in capitalism, and they are more prone to believe in one-party rule and be a little more authoritarian, if not totally authoritarian. Social Democrats, on the other hand, do believe in capitalism, and they believe in a Western-style democracy with free elections. But you got to look at each individual party, each individual case, because I will tell you this. Yeah, I saw some maps where their labeling of what's what is totally different than what I'm telling you right here. But I'm sticking to my guns on this, and this is what I call them. You can call them whatever you want. I'm just telling you to look specifically at the parties. And the two big questions are, do they believe in capitalism? One, and two, do they believe in democratic, freely elected elections? The more likely that they believe in open, fair, and free elections, and in capitalism, the more likely that they are social democrats. If they don't believe in capitalism, if they don't believe in open, fair, and free elections, they're more likely to be democratic socialists. Well, how much socialism is too much? This is the big burning question. All right, let's go back here. There are different parties in different countries that fit somewhere on this scale between social democrats and democratic socialists. The more mainstream Western in approach, the more likely they are social democrats. The more left-wing towards communists they are, the more likely they are to be democratic socialists. But different countries, different parties are on like a sliding scale. So the bigger question is, to what extent is a country socialist? And in answering this question, ask oneself, how many means of production, or to what extent does the government own a stake in or control any of the following? Transportation, communications, media, utility, the means of industrial manufacturing production. Do they own farms? How many safety net programs are offered by the government, such as unemployment, retirement benefits, medical benefits, housing assistance, food stamps, graduated tax rates? All this stuff is not directly addressed by Marx. It might be there by implication, but today, especially all these types of programs, a lot of people, particularly those on the right, refer to all of this as socialism down here. How much socialism is too much? Well, we clearly have a few socialist tendencies in the United States. And so I'm going to ask a question. Was it socialist when the U.S. government bailed out General Motors and then bought some, and when it did so, it took in exchange for the funds that advanced to General Motors to bail it out, it took back a stock ownership, a percentage interest in General Motors Corporation. during the financial crisis of 2008. So that's an example of the government having an interest in the means of production. Was that socialism? Some people say yes. Big question is, should the U.S. government assist important industries when foreign countries assist their companies when they compete in international trade? A lot of countries help provide financial assistance to, or other benefits to, their homegrown industries that go out and compete in world trade. Should the United States do so that American companies don't become disadvantaged? Well, if they do, that's very arguably a form of socialism. It would be very interesting to see what the people on the political right have to say about that. I'll give you an example. There's one, Paul Krugman, who writes for the New York Times, has advocated somewhere, and he's usually considered to be a left-wing economist. He's won the Nobel Prize, has perhaps suggested that the U.S. government may want to help companies like Boeing because it faces stiff international competition. And so anyway, he's saying that sometimes that's essential when you're talking about critical industries that have national security implications, especially that the government ought to be more aggressive, perhaps, in actually assisting financially companies to compete internationally. Would that be socialism? Yeah, some people would say so. Some people would say so. All right, the aging population. I'll take, like, for example, a lot of people, their parents, they get up there past in the late 60s up to their 90s or whatever, come down with Alzheimer's or various other problems, have to go into nursing homes. Nursing home costs about anywhere from $8,000 to $10,000 a month. There aren't too many families that I know of that can afford that, certainly for very long. So you talk about something like Medicaid. Now, a lot of people are going to rely on that going forward, especially as the population ages. Is that too much socialism? And if unemployment benefits, Social Security, now that monies get paid into that system, but there's always big questions about the financial solvency of things like Social Security. Section 8 housing assistance for persons of low income, food stamps. Is that too much socialism? Is it socialism? But anyway, okay, let's compare the performance of socialist countries, and then I'm going to talk about both basically democratic socialist and social democratic governments or parties of the United States. I'm talking about, let's look at we're going to talk about income per capita of the two countries. That's the amount of gross domestic product that a country generates versus the amount of people over the amount of people it has. So it tells you how productive each country is given the size of its population. And when we looked at this, we saw that the GDP, the per capita income, in terms of what is produced by the economy per person, we see that the United States is more efficient and a better run economy than any of these other countries. These are 2020 figures, and they are adjusted for differences in currency exchange rates. So we see right here that the U.S. beats all these Western European countries, and they beat Russia and China. But here's the interesting thing. Forbes magazine, and I think Forbes was regurgitating a study that the UN did because they took into account uh, they took the UN figures on how happy the population is. They took into account GDP, life expectancy, generosity. I guess that means social programs, social support. That probably means governmental programs, freedom and corruption income, how corrupt, takes all those factors into account. And the UN and Forbes magazine, here's how they rank the happiness of countries. So even though the US beat these countries in terms of dollars and cents, it was worse than all of these Western European countries, except it was not worse than Russia and China. And of course, one of the reasons why they're so bad is, especially in Russia's case, well, these are not only that, these are Russia and China are both authoritarian countries for all intents and purposes. But that's a very interesting thing in terms of the happiness rank versus GDP per person. So, a lot of right-wing folks talk about how bad socialism is in terms of its economic performance, and it's not as good as total free markets. But in terms of happiness ranking, you got to remember one of the problems with totally free market systems is that it has a tendency to make the rich get richer, and the fewer and fewer people have a tendency to benefit from all that wealth that's generated. So fewer and fewer people are making more and more money. And that's probably another reason why this rank is the way it is, which is just a total flip of the income per capita. So in terms of happiness, the social democratic countries seem to be doing quite well, thank you. But capitalism clearly beats authoritarian regimes. Interesting little chart there. Okay. And I say, go ahead. We talk about socialists and social democrats. These guys, Mitterrand was probably pretty close to being an absolute socialist, even sometimes some communist connections. But even when he got into power in France, he became pretty practical. I think that the history will show that he's never tried to shut off free and fair elections. He really governed more like a social Democrat than a democratic socialist. And Tony Blair, of course, supported the United States in the Iraq War. And he was a member of the British Labour Party, Prime Minister, the British Labour Party is really a social democratic party, even though they call themselves Labour. And this is Helmut Schmidt. He was also a social democrat. He was chancellor of West Germany before the Iron Curtain fell. And, he believed in capitalism. He was quite an economist, actually. So anyway, now here's the dirty laundry, of course. Now all of these guys, of course, are dictators. Stalin, it's estimated that he killed anywhere from 1 to 20 million. I tried to pin it down, and the more I read, the more confused I got. I mean, it's just virtually impossible to say. I mean, I think the records have been intentionally destroyed. A lot of people come up with figures just to make political points. But the estimates for how many people Stalin killed, it was between 1 million to 20 million. Seems like many estimates are in the 3 to 6 range. My guess is that he probably compares pretty favorably with Hitler, for example, who was, of course, a fascist. But the real champ is probably Mao Zedong. Excuse me. I consistently, when I looked at it, saw figures be 45 to 55 million. And I mean, you could put Hitler and Stalin together and you don't come up with that. But I will say one thing about this. a lot of these figures in terms of Mao, who of course was a Chinese communist, a dictator, just like Stalin, communist dictator. But in Mao's case, I think a lot of these statistics right here for Mao had to do with his policies and the Great Leap Forward. I think there was widespread famine. And so I think a lot of these people who died didn't necessarily die intentionally, although that's just food for another video. So even these numbers are foggy, but in terms of total death, Mao probably takes the cake. But I think a lot of those people are also an unintentional consequence, although after a while, if your policy is doing as bad as some of his were, you think you get the point and change course. But anyway, so that's a little bit on. And of course, in the United States especially, and really in Western Europe, but particularly the United States, we had the McCarthy Scare back in the late 40s and 50s, where Senator McCarthy tried to root out all the communist influences in government and even in Hollywood and everywhere. And everybody was afraid of being accused of being a communist. And we have what was known as the Red Scare. It was really just a nasty time. And he examined government employees, union members, actors, people in the arts, both musical and literary. A lot of people lost their jobs. Terrible situation, were blacklisted. But here's some famous people right here who were blacklisted because of the Red Scare, because they thought that they had connections to communism. Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, Leonard Bernstein, Leonard Burgess, the Batman, the Penguin. There we go. How about that? Pete Seeger, Burl Ives. My God, the guy from the Christmas Story. Anyway, Gypsy Rose Lee, a stripper, and Lloyd Bridges, Sea Hunt. Anyway, so that's, you don't want to go through those witch hunt situations of the Red Scare that we had many years ago. And I asked for some questions here. I point out that, that when it comes to governing in international politics and even domestic politics, I don't care what your political label is, leaders have a tendency to become very practical. And if they don't, things are going to go south for them very quickly. Things are going to go bad if they're not somewhat practical. Remember, the U.S. sided with the Soviet Union, now Russia, during World War II, even though it was a communist country, when we fought jointly against Nazi Germany in World War II. And even during World War II, the Chinese communists allied with their mortal enemies, the Kuomintang, another Chinese. That was the nationalist Chinese, who now are on Taiwan. They actually allied together to fight against Imperial Japan during World War II. And I'll just also say this, and this is a huge point. China right now has the second largest economy in the world, and probably one day, not in the not too distant future, may actually be number one. And one of the reasons for that is that despite the fact that they have despite the fact that the Communist Party is in control, and at the present time they have what amounts to a dictatorship, and despite the fact they call themselves communists, their economic system has been relaxed and is very capitalistic right now, and it's really not a communist economic system hardly at all anymore. It's more of they just call themselves communist. But in any event, that's a very important point right there, especially with respect to communist China. So I'll just let you look at that for 1 second. And, maybe we'll do another video on this and some of the things that we just sort of skimmed over. Okay, so that leaves us with some concluding questions as well as our thoughts and a few opinions. I think it's fair to say that there are positives and negatives to just about any philosophy. And so you got to weigh and balance the positives and the negatives, but be fair and objective and balanced. No knee-jerk reactions, not too much emotion in there. It'll lead you astray. Is socialism evil? Well, to me, the question is what aspect of it are you talking about? And it's also a question of how much socialism and how much capitalism. In this day and age, everyone is likely to be a beneficiary in one form or another of some aspect of what some would call a socialistic program. And all you have to look at is something like Social Security. If your mom and dad go in a nursing home and need Medicaid assistance, after a while, at $10,000 a month, not many people can afford that for very long. Medicare, a lot of people, and hopefully you don't need food stamps, but who knows, you may be between a rock and a hard place financially, and you may need food stamps. I used to work for a housing finance agency, and we administered something called a Section 8 program, which was rental assistance for poor folks to give them housing. Having people in homes as opposed to out on the street is the way to avoid a lot of crime. So anyway, what aspects of socialism are you talking about? The real question is if you're talking about socialist candidates for office or socialist politicians, the real key is, do they believe in open, free, and fair elections? Yeah, and when I say democracy and elections, I'm talking about open, fair elections where the government doesn't try to manipulate the results, where you have more than one genuine political party, true competition in the election between the parties, and there's no corruption in terms of calculating results. It's not like the show elections that the communist system often puts on, or a lot of dictators put on. There really aren't open, fair, and free elections at all. They're just there for show to say they have elections when in fact they're not open and fair and genuine elections. Because we all want a free society that is run by the rule of law. And if they believe in free and open elections, that's a big step towards being, American in terms of ideals, and Western European in terms of, we believe in elections because it gives the people voice in government and it allows for competing ideas. Competition in this context is a very good thing because competition in the realm of ideas helps society to progress and to be free, open, and fair, and to get good results. Western European style socialism, and I'm talking here mostly about social democrats, they believe in safety net programs like I've just talked about, and they believe in open and free and fair elections. I mean, those types of candidates and public officials probably in most instances should not be alarming to the American electorate because they share many of the values and ideals that, for example, Americans and like Western Europeans, they pretty much go along. I'm not trying to just be European here. I mean, like Japan is pretty much in this boat, and there are, and of course Australia and India has its own democratic system. So I'm not trying to overlook those folks. I'm just more familiar from my studies, frankly, when I was in college and everything with Western Europe. So I'm not trying to be, discriminating against anybody. Anyway, but here's this is a major thing right here. This aspect of the United Nations criteria when they did a study, I guess a happiness quotient. There's no question that the United States on a per capita income in terms of GDP wealth generated, that America has done better than any of the countries that seem to have been significantly influenced by social democrats or socialism. However, those numbers in terms of the happiness quotient were totally flipped. If you're just talking about dollars and cents, the United States did the best. If you're talking about taking into account other things like support networks, lack of corruption, and I went through those other things that should be taken into account in terms of how well off a society is. Let me see here if I can find that thing here. Just one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We were comparing economic performance here. The United States was on top of these other countries when it came just to the dollars and cents analysis. There's no question this was GDP per person. But when you had the happiness rank, you'll notice that the number 20 is worse than these Western European countries. And so, in a sense, that sort of makes some sense because obviously social programs do cost, and they probably do weigh on the productivity of the economy. But money isn't everything, and I think that that's kind of what these two charts basically show right here. So in any event, if you're talking about socialism, what aspect of it are you talking about? Just to say that socialism is evil or socialism is the boogeyman is probably way too broad. So when we hear charges sometimes that it's that something is wrong because it is socialism, if somebody says that a policy position is evil because it's socialistic or whatever, it's just kind of like McCarthy era scare tactics when we had blacklists and the communist scares and the witch hunts that we had back in the day. In some very unfortunate times in this country. As we saw these folks here who were blacklisted because they had or were alleged to have had some connections with communists or socialists. So it's just a remnant of McCarthy era scare tactics. Let's talk about the particular policy provision that some candidate or some public official is advocating or trying to implement, and not just say, oh, it's bad because it's socialistic. It's just too broad to do that, and it's unfair, and it sort of cheapens the debate. All right, here we go. Same question, is communism evil? Well, Marx was opposed to slavery, so that's good. And he was trying to basically improve the lot of workers, to improve, harsh working conditions and all that. So where he was coming from was fairly noble. But of course, in practice, people are people, and some people are greedy and they want power. And folks like Stalin and Mao eventually became authoritarian and implemented repressive societies. And in fact, they're guilty of genocide in a lot of well, they're guilty of genocide. And but the biggest problems with communism, even if you take away the terrible aspect of any kind of resort to authoritarianism or dictatorship, which communist systems always seem to eventually do. That's not necessarily what Marx wanted, but in practice, that's the way it's worked out. And that's so, in a sense, a true Marxist system has really sort of never been given a total chance, so to speak, because it's eventually always been subverted. But it's been subverted probably because of some of its inherent problems. There's an aspect of everybody gets what they need, and that's a good idea. The idea of equality has some appeal to it, but the problem is that you reduce the incentive that people have to excel at anything, to produce a better product, to produce products more efficiently. There's the moral hazard that people get lazy because if everybody is paid, if you have a classless society, nobody has any incentive to try to get ahead, and the incentive is to just languish around and let somebody else do the work. It's called moral hazard. And the system itself has shown, maybe it's because of the 5-year system or whatever, unlike what Marx thought, it's not going to produce less. I mean, it's not going to produce more. It actually ends up producing less. And the other thing is I need to say this, Marxism hasn't reduced war because workers have shown that they are more loyal to workers in other countries than they are to their own country. Workers have shown themselves to be more loyal to their country than to workers in other nations. Government planning, the 5-year planning system, has shown itself to be inferior to the capitalist system. So the track record of communism has not been good, and the biggest proof positive of that is a country run by the Communist Party of that country, namely China, has implemented and allowed a lot of capitalism to flourish in what's supposed to be a communist system. So I don't think to a fair-minded person that anyone can argue that communism is superior to capitalism when it comes to generating goods and services and increasing the wealth of a society. But the worst thing about communism, unquestionably, is that they have practiced totalitarianism. And I don't care if you're socialist or even a capitalist system for that matter. If you're producing dictatorships, you've gone off the deep end because nobody wants to live in a repressive regime. We here at Reason and Balance support the rule of law, individual rights and freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, due process of law, limited government, where government is also subject to the law just like private individuals. So as actually practiced, this thing about the consistent habit that the communist regimes have of resorting to dictators is the most terrible aspect of it. And of course, there's been the resort to genocide in instances which, well, it speaks for itself. It's just awful. Okay, but it should be pointed out right here that it's not just communist countries that can become dictatorships. Now, there's no holier than thou in all this. Democracies as well can degenerate into dictatorships. Just consider Germany in the 30s when Hitler rose to power originally largely through democratic means. And also communist countries like today's communist China have an economic system that has been moving in the direction of capitalism. So you see communism, one-party rule in an economic system that is largely capitalistic. So things get very confused. And so when we say that one of the worst things about communism is its tendency towards dictatorship, that does not necessarily make a capitalistic system or a democracy immune to that danger. And so in any event, those are some of our thoughts and opinions and questions that we have. I'd be glad, it would be great to hear what yours are. Please, we do have a mechanism to allow you to make contributions to our cause, financial ones, donations, on our website at reasonandbalance.com. And also we have, click that like button, please, and we would very much appreciate it. So this is Dave Lentz, and I will talk to you next time. Thanks a lot.
Dum dum da dum dum da da dum dum da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da dum dum da dum dum da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da 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 dum 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 da dum dum da dum dum da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da dum dum da dum dum da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da 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 dum dum